Estás muteado, Juan.
Hola, muy buenas noches, sean bienvenidos una vez más a la Hoja del Olivo. En esta ocasión tenemos la visita de Ryan Hinkley, que tiene un excelente blog, el cual es el motivo por el que lo tenemos hoy de visita. Su blog se llama La ciencia es verdadera y la iglesia también. Se encuentra en citatsit.home.blog. Dejaremos el enlace del mismo. Ryan es un investigador independiente, es un bloguero, y él ama y estudia especialmente el Libro de Mormón. Le encantan estos aspectos de los tiempos proféticos, el análisis de los mismos contenidos con relación a la historia. Él es estudiante de ingeniería y es aparte un padre, un esposo. Sirvió en la misión en Brasil, él habla portugués, y hoy estamos muy contentos de tenerlo con nosotros para hablar de una de las propuestas que a mí me han parecido interesantes por ser distintas o diferente a lo que generalmente se propone con respecto a la lectura del Libro de Mormón, y es la relación que él encuentra entre Göbekli Tepe y el mundo de los Jareditas. Entonces le damos la bienvenida. Es muy curiosa, muy interesante esta propuesta. Y para los que no saben, Göbekli Tepe es uno de los centros antiguos más remotos de la civilización humana. De hecho, está considerado un lugar arqueológico más antiguo del viejo continente. Y pues Ryan va a presentarnos su propuesta, luego de lo cual haremos algunas preguntas y esperamos que ustedes también puedan unirse a las mismas. De antemano, muchas gracias por estar con nosotros y aceptar nuestra invitación. El tiempo es de ustedes.
Sí, explicar un poco la dinámica. Este capítulo, bueno, será en inglés con Ryan. Después sacaremos una versión que estará subtitulada y solo igual pueden ir haciendo sus preguntas y las vamos a hacer incluso para Ryan. Así que si tienen, vayanlas poniendo. So, again, welcome, Ryan. So,
thank you.
It's your time.
Okay, yeah. Well, thanks for that introduction. I'm excited to speak with you guys tonight. Like Juan was saying, Göbekli Tepe is a very important site in modern-day Turkey. It's actually really close to the border of Syria, I believe, if I'm getting my geography right. And it seems to be what some people call the oldest known temple that we found, the archaeologists have found. And this right here is a picture. Can you see my cursor at all? Okay. No, you can't see the cursor? Okay. Well,
No, the cursor, no.
This is a picture of Göbekli Tepe, or maybe a reconstruction of it, but this is what it kind of would have looked like back in the day. It has these giant T pillars. You can see in the middle, there's these T pillars, and they have some interesting symbols on them, which we'll talk about. And along the outside, there are also T pillars. And so archaeologists are kind of amazed that what should have been hunter-gatherers about 12,000 years ago that built this, they're amazed that they had the skills to build something like this. So my theory is that maybe the Jaredites came from this place. Maybe this was the Great Tower that's mentioned in the Book of Mormon. And I will show some slides about this tonight. So first off, it's really important to realize that the Book of Mormon never says the word Babel, or it never says the word Tower of Babel, right? It never calls the place where the Jaredites come from the Tower of Babel. It always calls it the Great Tower, or a tower to get to heaven, right? And the word tower, of course, could be translated in multiple ways. Göbekli Tepe wasn't necessarily a tower per se, but it was a large structure, and it was sort of a temple according to what we know about it. And so just keep that in mind as we go forward. Now, a lot of people ask me when they hear about this theory, they say, well, does that mean that you think that there were two towers? And I say no to that, because what I think is that the Tower of Babel is actually a myth that is based on the real Great Tower. Okay, so just like the Book of Mormon never calls it Babel, and that's for a good reason, because I think that there probably never was a tower called Babel. But I think that perhaps Göbekli Tepe was this great tower, and then over the millennia, so Göbekli Tepe was about 9,000 BC, as you see here, and then the Tower of Babel story was written about 500 BC, and so you have about 8,500 years of oral history where that myth could be, or that story could be turned into kind of a legend and then into a myth, and there's a lot of things that are wrong with it, if that makes sense.
One question here that I think would be good. The other day on Sunday school, actually, they were talking about introduction in the Book of Mormon.
Mhm.
And I mentioned that, well, there was a tower when the languages were confused, but some people believe that it's the Babel Tower, right?
Mhm.
But I had a member that came after me after the class ended, and it's like, no, you shouldn't be saying that, like it's in the Book of Mormon, and like, no, the Book of Mormon never mentions that it's the Torre de Babel. But she
Mhm.
was like, no, it's in the introduction. So what would you say to those persons that consider the introduction of the Book of Mormon as if it was part of the Book of Mormon?
Right. Yeah. So let me just go back real quick. The introduction is what they're talking about was written much later. It was written by some member of the church, probably not too long ago, maybe in the 1980s. The title page of the Book of Mormon, which was actually written by Moroni, does not. It mentions the tower, but it calls it a tower to get to heaven, as you can see on this lower quotation right here. It does not call it the Tower of Babel, which suggests to me that the Nephites did not have that story. Well, they had the story of a tower, right? But they did not have the story that called it the Tower of Babel. Does that make sense?
Y yo también podría agregar ahí como respuesta, Javier, que el mito de la Torre de Babel que se trae de Babilonia con los compiladores, copistas judíos a su regreso del exilio, es un mito que está retomado también de ahí, de esa misma zona, al considerar que Babilonia es la última de una serie de asentamientos que se encuentran en la región del río Éufrates y Tigris. Entonces, aunque se dice que todo empezó en Sumer sí tiene mayor relación con esta zona de Turquía y su influencia, y son muy anteriores a lo que sería finalmente Babel, que es una reinterpretación que hacen los judíos anteriores. Entonces, quizá esto no sea objeción si podemos irnos más atrás y ver dónde Babilonia retoma estos mitos y los considera mitos fundacionales, pero que están en esta zona que va de Anatolia, de Turquía, de Babilonia, y que está presente en estas culturas. Entonces, a mí me parece interesante precisamente la idea de esta puerta de apertura a los cielos, de esta torre de apertura a los cielos, y que curiosamente, como Ryan señala, el libro de Mormón no le diga Torre de Babel, y que nos retrotrae a que ellos por lo menos Morón y lo que él está revisando, no está recuperando su mito de la fuente babilónica, sino una fuente más antigua.
Do you want me to translate that, or?
Yeah.
Well,
Unless,
basically,
yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
yeah, I will do a summary because I don't
Yeah.
remember exactly. But he's mentioning that another possible answer is the relation that you said, as you said, the Book of Mormon is taken from a different source, that it's more ancient, right? So that's why it doesn't call it the Torre de Babel or Babel Tower. So yeah, he's agreeing with you that it's a myth, that and the summer is not the origin as a lot of people think, but more these areas of Turkey and Göbekli Tepe. So yeah, he mentioned just that.
Okay. Yes. Yep. For sure. Yeah. So that it's really interesting how the Book of Mormon never says that, and so yeah, I don't think there's two towers. I think there was one, but I think it was corrupted into the story that we have now. So there's some interesting things if you really look into the story of even the Tower of Babel. So if you want to say that the Tower of Babel is like a ziggurat in Babylonia right now or whatever, then let's see what the Bible actually says. So first it says that Noah, right? Noah comes on his ark and he lands on the mountain of Ararat. And then later on it says that the people left from there and they traveled from the east. So they traveled west and they found a plain which they called Shinar, or the land of Shinar, right? And so I think here in verse 3 in the pink, it says, let us go build a city and a tower, right? So they're building this tower, the Tower of Babel, or whatever the great tower is, in the land of Shinar. And so that should be west of the Ararat Mountains, okay? So I'm going to show a map here. And it's kind of hard, maybe it's a little hard to see, but here we have, up at the top, you have Mount Ararat. And then you have below in the red, you have all of these sites that people say might be the Tower of Babel. And you see how none of them are actually west of Mount Ararat. Only Göbekli Tepe is west of that mountain. So if we're going to use even the story itself of the Tower of Babel for some evidence of where the tower might be, it pretty much requires that it be to the west of that mountain, and none of those other ones comply with that requirement. I'm sure I'm not catching all of the sites, but those are some of the big ones that I've heard right there. So this land Shinar, it means two rivers. If you were to translate that, it means two rivers, and Göbekli Tepe just happens to be right between two rivers, and they're big rivers, the Euphrates and the Tigris, right? So here you can see a couple of maps where it shows exactly where Göbekli Tepe is between those two rivers. And so if the tower, in air quotes, if it was built in the land of Shinar, in the land between two rivers, Göbekli Tepe certainly fits that requirement as well. So yeah, the tower, so that even the Book of Mormon, we'll stop talking about the Tower of Babel for a second. In the Book of Mormon, it mentions that this great tower, there was a confusion of languages, right? And so some people interpret that to mean, obviously, that everybody spoke the same language, and then God came and he confounded the languages, and then we ended up with a whole bunch of different languages: English, Spanish, Portuguese, all that kind of stuff, right? Well, according to science, or languages, or at least the Indo-European languages, diverged about 9,000 years ago. And it happened in Anatolia, which is exactly where Göbekli Tepe is. Now, I wasn't super clear on this, but Göbekli Tepe did exist about 12,000 years ago. It was, if I remember correctly, it was built about 12,000 years ago, and then it was abandoned about 10 or 9,000 years ago. So that falls right into that area of when languages would have diverged. Now, how literal this story is of languages being confounded there and all that is obviously up for debate. Obviously a lot of the scientists probably would not agree that that story is literal. I'm definitely open either way to what it means, but it is just very interesting that the languages as we know it, and if you even look at this chart, you'll find Spanish down there and you can find English and all that. You can trace it back to that area and that time, which is really interesting. If you were to take the Tower of Babel as existing about 4,000 years ago, which is what most people think, then it falls into this that red box that I drew there up kind of on the left side of this chart. And as you can see, there are already multiple languages that existed at that point, right? We're already well on our way to getting all of the languages of the earth. But if you back up 5,000 years more, then you really are at just a few languages.
Y bueno, aquí precisamente lo que señalas es que tampoco podemos tener una evidencia de la diferenciación y el origen de las lenguas, porque la escritura vendrá mucho tiempo después. Estamos hablando en este caso, del Neolítico, en cualquiera de sus dos niveles, y la escritura va a aparecer ya en la edad de los metales, de una manera un poco más tardía por estas mismas zonas, pero los lenguajes ya están diferenciados. Entonces, a veces queremos hacer aparecer a los lenguajes y a la escritura como si fueran un acontecimiento paralelo, cuando es uno después de otro y después de miles de años. Entonces, es posible que en estas regiones, que son las más antiguas de manera arqueológica, las lenguas se hayan dividido precisamente en diferentes aspectos. En esta zona, las lenguas indoeuropeas que ya citaste se empezarían a diferenciar, algunas protosemíticas más abajo también empezarían a diferenciarse, y algunas de ese tipo de lenguas son las que debieron haber emigrado con los jareditas.
Okay, he mentioned a lot, but he's saying, let me just ask a question to Juan. Juan, dijiste que la escritura aparece después que el lenguaje y es difícil distinguirlo, ¿no?
Son periodos muy distintos. O sea, tú tienes a gente construyendo monumentos, construyendo templos, intercambiando ideas, pero solamente tienen representaciones ideográficas, pero todavía no tienen una escritura tal y como la conoceremos en Egipto y más adelante, o en Egipto y en Sumer, que son los lugares donde empiezan a aparecer la historia, las primeras textos escritos, pero son mucho después de que las lenguas han sido diferenciadas. Sumer, que es uno de los referentes más antiguos donde se escribe historia, es posterior a ese periodo de Göbekli Tepe.
La diversificación de las lenguas.
De diversificación de las lenguas.
Okay, so he's mentioning that some people refer to Sumer as sometimes, as you pointed there, like the Tower of Babel, but this is more like the writing, right? But the languages evolve before the writing, right? Because we have the writing with Sumer, Egypt, and all those branches, right? But he was mentioning that the languages, like, they date before the writing, before that the human being was able to write their story.
Right.
So yeah, he was just supporting your claim.
Yeah.
Y yo agregaría antes, los sumerios, los cabezas negras, tienen una lengua distinta a los que después llegan y se asientan en la misma zona, y eso también puede explicarte, que parece interesante, ellos no son semitas, no tienen una lengua semítica, tienen una lengua muy diferente a los de la región, y lo que sí se ha podido comparar o encontrar ha sido expresiones arqueológicas que son parecidas también a las que se encuentran en Göbekli Tepe y en estos monumentos que creo que quizá no hemos detallado, pero son diferentes taulas que representan animales, que representan un encuentro entre lo sagrado, que representan a hombres y mujeres que aparentemente son o adorados o representados junto con esta fauna y flora, muchas serpientes, y es un templo, pero donde la gente no habita, no es una ciudad, son pueblos nómadas, pueblos pastores o pueblos de recolectores que han edificado sus edificios, se reúnen religiosamente en ellos y acuden cada cierto ciclo de tiempo y han hecho esas representaciones que son monumentales y grandiosas y que después hay expresiones artísticas que vendrán más adelante y que nos recuerdan las estelas o la forma en que son representadas a Göbekli Tepe o a los encuentros más antiguos. Algunas de las zonas de la región se han perdido por que se ha introducido estos de las presas, se hundieron algunas estatuas anteriormente relacionadas con el mismo lugar, pero que se encontraban en zonas o kilómetros diferentes. A eso tienes que sumarle que está la guerra de Irak, que también dañó el asunto, que la gente que vive en la región son kurdos, es una zona muy inestable, pero lo que se ha recuperado es asombroso, es monumental, y si tú lo puedes ver, Stonehenge en ese sentido es más simple porque se tiene representaciones de animales, de plantas, de seres humanos gigantes, de representaciones que aluden a temas astronómicos, ordenados en estas taulas, porque la mayoría son edificios estelas en forma de T con figuras y ordenadas de tal forma que hacen una representación práctica de lo que casi todo templo antiguo tendrá más adelante. Entonces, por eso es interesante Göbekli Tepe como no solamente una propuesta para el mundo de los Jareditas, sino una propuesta de los primeros encuentros civilizatorios entre pueblos que eran nómadas, que eran recolectores, que eran cazadores, que tenían a veces sus rebaños, pero que todavía no han edificado ciudades, pero han edificado este gran templo en esa zona.
Okay, so dime eso. Juan, dijiste que los Somer cabezas negras son los que llegan después a esta área de Göbekli Tepe, pero hablan un idioma diferente, ¿verdad?
No, ellos llegan a Sobre. Sobre es un lugar de asentamiento de diferentes pueblos. Los más antiguos que tenemos son los sumerios, los cabezas negras, se llaman a sí mismos. Van a llegar babilónicos, van a llegar otros pueblos semitas, otros pueblos no semitas a sentarse en la misma región de Sumer. Y también tienes ahí una especie de Babel en el mismo lugar. Y algunas representaciones de Sumer se parecen o hacen evocación a lo que también encontramos en Göbekli Tepe.
Okay, so he's mentioning that in Sumer we had the Blackheads, that they arrived there to that region, and some different towns also that arrived to that place. Juan also explained a little bit of what is Göbekli Tepe and what the buildings, probably you're going to mention it in your slides, but he mentioned about what does the buildings represent, like animals, and that it's the first, as you mentioned, the first temple, that it's way more complex than what we have on England or Stonehenge, and that this is interesting not just because of the Jaredite perspective or theory, but also because it can be seen as a union of people or towns that were nomads with other civilizations, something like that. It's like a summary of what he mentioned.
Okay. Yeah. I think it is definitely the oldest. Well, it's one of the oldest, if not the oldest, temples that they think they've found so far. And it's interesting that as you read Genesis in the Bible, there's no mention of any temple built before the Tower of Babel is built. And so that's perhaps another evidence to show that, well, if this is the first temple, and then the first record we have of something like this being built is in Genesis 11 or the Tower of Babel, then we can put those together. But also, I think one was mentioning how on Göbekli Tepe, it's just the symbols are full of animals, right? There are animals everywhere. They have lions, they have birds, they've got boars or pigs and cattle and crocodiles, snakes. And it is interesting, given the modern LDS temples and the emphasis on the creation, and how Göbekli Tepe seems to have whoever built it seems to have a great reverence for the creation as well. In fact, I don't have slides about this, but there are theories aside from mine, but there are theories that Göbekli Tepe was the Garden of Eden, and that whether either Adam and Eve lived there, or it was just built there after them, or that Adam and Eve was a myth that came down from Göbekli Tepe. So that it's really interesting. It's a really interesting place, and I encourage anyone listening to go read up some more about Göbekli Tepe, because I definitely won't do it justice in this presentation. I obviously don't know everything about it, but yeah. So we'll keep going now. Just real quick, this slide, I just threw it in to show that this is one of the walls of Göbekli Tepe, and I think I'll show a picture of kind of what it looked like. It was kind of a circular enclosure, and there were multiple of these, and they would use like mud as a mortar between these stones, kind of like bricks. Now I know that when you read Genesis 11, it says that they actually used bricks, not stone, and I totally get that. But it is just interesting that they did indeed use a mortar or a slime, which is exactly what the Bible says about that. This slide is there's a lot going on, so I'm sorry about that. But there actually isn't a link between Göbekli Tepe and the Tower of Babel as far as the language goes, or the words that are used. If you actually look up what Babel means, it comes from the Akkadian Bab Ilu, which means gate of God, right? The Bab is the gate and the Ilu is God. Well, in Göbekli Tepe, these pictures right here, these are some of the symbols that are found, and these are primarily found on the two main T-pillars in the most famous of the enclosures. I believe it's enclosure D. And as you can see, there's an H symbol, like the letter H in our alphabets, right? And in searching in some of the languages that were a little bit younger than what people at Göbekli Tepe would have been speaking, there's one language called Luwian, or I'm not sure exactly how to say it, but they have found this same H symbol in this language, and they've discovered that H symbol means gate, or like a door, right? And so, or porta, like you can see that word porta because these screenshots were taken from a French, I believe it's French textbook or something, and French is very similar to Spanish, right? And so the H could mean gate, which is really interesting, gate of God, right? And also this one on the right shows kind of has an H symbol, or it's kind of like two vertical lines that are kind of enclosed in like brackets, or they're kind of in a circle or something, and that resembles this H inside of parentheses right here, for lack of better description. And they've discovered that in Luwian, that symbol means God or goddess, right? And so put it together, obviously, and you get gate of God, which is very interesting, I think, to show that there may actually be a link, that these places are related in some way.
Y fíjate, Javier, sí, para quienes nos escuchan, es un lugar donde también hay representaciones de seres desencarnados, y y precisamente tiene esta idea de poder unir lo terrestre con lo celeste, y que hace también advocación a lo que en otros lugares serán los dioses de las tormentas, como es el caso de Baal en la región cananea, o Yahvé, que también tiene esa advocación de dios de las tormentas en medio de las montañas. Y lo interesante aquí es que en la era neolítica, la gente hace entierros. Los neandertales también sabemos que han hecho entierros, pero la construcción de ese templo no solamente con la idea de honrar a los muertos, sino de presentar que los muertos aún desencarnados pueden tener un ascenso o una comunión con los dioses de la montaña, con los dioses que garantizan la lluvia y el alimento, y que pueden estar presentes. Entonces vas a encontrar representaciones de seres desencarnados y de seres reencarnados o encarnados habitando estos lugares llenos de fauna y de flora.
Okay, so Juan mentioned that in this place in Göbekli Tepe, there was also a representation of beings without flesh. So they have the idea to merge the earthly things with the celestial things, and that they make reference. They try to make reference to what later will become in the storm deities. And the interesting thing is that even in the Neolithic age, even we know that the Neanderthals, they bury their deads, but there was a way to represent that even the people without flesh, without being alive, they will be joining with the gods of the mountains. ¿Dije todo, Juan?
Sí, exactamente. Son dioses de las montañas que prometen efectivamente poder elevar a quienes le adoran.
Yeah, so he mentioned there are gods of the mountains, that they promise that they will elevate all the ones who worship them.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Juan, for bringing that up. I do know that, Göbekli Tepe, there's a lot of symbolism that's carved in there that may have to do with an afterlife, or some kind of cult of the dead, or their soul leaving this earth and going into heaven and stuff like that. These pillars that are shown here in this picture, and I think I'll have a better picture later on, but they do form a gate as they go up like this, and there appears to be, I think there's like a hole, like in the wall. You have an enclosure, and you have these two pillars there, and then somewhere in the wall there's like a hole, which is about the size of a human head, and there are carvings of headless humans around the whole place there, and some suggest that perhaps they believed that the soul would exit through that gate into the heavens, which was aligned with certain constellations. And so, it's really interesting. And the fact that the language here, or these symbols, may indicate it's a gate of some sort, and there's gods, goddesses, whatever. It's really interesting that it probably was some sort of religious site, and it had to do with the afterlife or reincarnation or some sort of life after death, which is very interesting, given what we know about temples and stuff like that. So yes, thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, so here's a better picture of one of those T-pillars. This is also an enclosure D, and it's one of those big main ones in the middle. And it has what they call a bucranium, or the skull of a bull, a male cow, right? And it's carved into that. You can see it's this arrow shows it's up there, kind of underneath almost to the top, but not quite. And it's interesting that some legends would say that the bull symbolizes Nimrod, or Nimrod was symbolized by the bull. Of course, he's known as the mighty hunter, right? And he, of course, would have hunted bulls, which back then may or may not have been necessarily domesticated, but there was the auroch, which was basically the pre-domesticated cow, right? And they were a little bit bigger than the cows we have today, and definitely had a lot of meat on them, just like cows do today. And so it would have been a very good thing to hunt for your people. And so as you can probably remember in the Book of Ether, they do draw a connection between this great tower and Nimrod. And the valley that is to the north of the tower, or the north of wherever the brother Jared is named after Nimrod. So it's interesting that this pillar has a bull on it, which could mean Nimrod, maybe not, but the symbolism there is really interesting. If we're going to think of Göbekli Tepe as the place where the Jaredites came from. On the other pillar, so this would be the second T pillar in the middle. There's the same symbol that we saw with the H, but if you notice underneath it, there's a circle and like this crescent shape, right? Some archaeologists identify this as a solely lunar H symbol, or like a necklace. It'd kind of be where the necklace would be if this T pillar were a person, right? So they think it might have to do with the sun and the moon, which of course is the heavens, right? In kind of the same mythology as Nimrod, there is this character called Semiramis, if I'm saying that correctly. And she's a female, and she's known as the Queen of Heaven. Obviously, the moon and the sun are in heaven, and she's kind of like the mother god, right? Nimrod is her husband in this legend, in this myth, and she's the mother or the wife. And it's kind of a weird myth from what I've read. Nimrod dies or something, but then she has a son, and it's like Nimrod reincarnated or something like that. So anyway, it's just interesting that we could have a bull or Nimrod imagery and a Semiramis imagery inside of Göbekli Tepe, which again draws a connection to Nimrod. This would be like an aerial view of the main part of Göbekli Tepe, and this at the very top is enclosure D, which is the most famous and the one that I know most about. And here you can see I kind of pointed out where these T pillars are. We have Nimrod on the left, or the bull, sorry, and we have the heaven one on the right, and they do form a gate, and which is really interesting. So anyone doing rituals there maybe would have seen it as a gate, and looking through it, they probably could have seen the stars. And if it was aligned to certain constellations at a certain time of year, it would have been a big deal for them to do their rituals at that time of year. So really interesting stuff there.
Sí, antes de que continúen,
Yeah.
precisamente lo que nos está presentando Ryan es cómo podríamos ligar las tradiciones más antiguas de las deidades semíticas, en este caso babilónicas, con las representaciones o símbolos encontrados en Göbekli. Recordar que el nombre de Seminaris, de Nimrod, y de Tammuz, son nombres o expresiones que se van a encontrar en toda esta zona. Lo vamos a ver con los hebreos y los cananeos con su panteón del dios El, la diosa Acera y el hijo Baal o Yahvé. O en Egipto también tendremos a la diosa madre con su hijo y padres de los dioses. Y esto es una constante en toda la región. Y en esta zona de Turquía y más abajito vamos a encontrar parte de la región griega, y parte de esa región griega continental nos va a recordar a la religión cretense y a la religión a otras protorreligiones griegas, cuya característica esencial va a ser la representación de uno de los dioses o del hijo de los dioses como un toro. Vamos a ver que esto también se aparece después en algunas representaciones de Yahvé como el dios oro. Vamos a encontrar en Egipto a Hathor, la diosa, representada como una vaca sagrada que a veces tiene a un hijo toro. Y todas estas expresiones podemos también encontrarlos, de acuerdo a lo que nos expone Ryan, en Göbekli.
¿En Egipto a quién encontramos?
Tenemos, por ejemplo, a la diosa Hathor, que es la diosa sagrada. Cuando ustedes vean la traducción de José Smith del libro de Abraham, y hay un símbolo de una vaquita en uno de los facsímiles, esa es la diosa Hathor. Ella a veces tiene a su hijo Hathor, como Hator.
Hathor, ok.
Y ella a veces tiene a su hijo representado por un toro, también un toro joven. En algunos casos vemos a Zeus incluso personificándose como toro. Y en particular, si hay una conexión entre Babilonia y Göbekli Tepe, sería precisamente encontrar a esta tríada de padre, madre e hijo dioses, representaciones del hijo en forma de toro como Yahvé, o Baal, que a la vez son dioses de las tormentas, como también aparece en Göbekli Tepe. Y es interesante que Ryan recupera la traducción de José Smith, donde se presenta ese conflicto entre Nimrod y Abraham. Se vuelve a mover los personajes a otro tiempo para representar el conflicto de las dos religiones. En este caso, Nimrod representando a estos pueblos nómadas, cazadores, que tienen esta religión. Y cuando hemos visto a Acera, la diosa, hay que recordar que ella está asociada en el templo de Jerusalén con el sol, con fenómenos astronómicos, con las huestes del cielo. Ella es la madre, la gobernante de los hijos de los dioses, los 70 hijos, y esos hijos son expresiones de figuras en el cielo que son estrellas. Esto mismo, de acuerdo con lo que Ryan presenta en su blog, como en la exposición que nos está dando aquí, tiene su correlación mucho más antigua en Göbekli Tepe.
Okay. Give me a sec. Okay, so give me a sec because I took some notes. Okay, so he's mentioning that you are retaking this link between the Babylon tradition with Göbekli Tepe, but this is also very common in this area. He's mentioned that seminaries or Tammuz, they will be later retake, maybe by the Jews, right? With El, Yahweh, and Asherah. I'm not sure how to say it in English.
Asherah.
Asherah. and that this in this area of Turkey, then we'll find the Greek people and the Cretan. I don't know how to say it, Cretense, this religion of the Greek people, and they will have these similar characteristics between God, and they will have a son also, which will be represented like a bull, and that we have also this in Egypt with the goddess Hathor, and her son will be also represented as a bull, and also sometimes Zeus of the Greek mythology will be also be represented as a bull, and that in Göbekli Tepe we'll see these three personages: the father, the mother, and the son.
Mhm.
Right? Sometimes the son being represented as a bull, and also as a storm deities, also as we'll later see of Yahweh and all these gods that the Jews will retake. And he's praising that you retake this, uh, the Joseph Smith translations mentioning Nimrod to represent these stories. And he mentioned about Asherah. Uh, she's also known as the Queen of Heaven, with his 70 sons that are represented as the stars.
Mhm.
Did I miss something, Juan? Me faltó algo. Okay.
That's good. Yeah,
No,
no,
sí, está
good.
bien, no, no falta nada.
Yeah, excellent. That was really good comment there. It does appear that um, a lot of the mythologies around the world seem to have, or maybe stemmed from Göbekli Tepe, which only strengthens the idea that it is kind of its origin point for humanity. Um, Obviously we have the bull, we have the Queen of Heaven, we have these deities, and if it is related to Nimrod, then we have also the sun, which is Tammuz, which was on the last one here, Tammuz, which in some mythologies is also the same as Nimrod, and so the father is also the same as the son, right? There's this confusion, and there was the same confusion with Asherah and El and Yahweh. Like, was Asherah married to Yahweh, or was she married to El, or was Yahweh El? There's just this confusion, right? And it just appears that Göbekli Tepe was kind of this commonplace, and that especially Egyptian and Greek and Canaanite religions such as El and Yahweh and stuff may have originated here. And there's actually a guy who wrote a paper about the Roman god Janus, which he says that he discovered at Göbekli Tepe, and I don't remember the details of it, but he goes through and he shows how like Janus was like this double-headed god where he looked forward into the future, but he also looked back into the past or something like that, and how like that could come from the T-pillars. And it was fascinating. But I do think that there are connections between some of these mythologies around the world and Göbekli Tepe, which in my mind just strengthens the idea that it was this great tower. Obviously, the Jaredites would have come from this place, or the Great Tower, and they weren't the only people, right? There probably would have been other people that were led away from the Great Tower, and if they had some sort of common religion, obviously vestiges of that religion would survive in the various places around the world, and I think that's what we see. So it's very interesting. A lot of times I get asked about, is there some kind of DNA proof about this? And honestly, I don't have a good answer to that, because I think there's a lack of DNA evidence. There's a lack of specimens from which to take DNA from Göbekli Tepe. There's not many human remains there. They have found human remains, but as far as testing the DNA of them, I'm not sure much has been done, at least the last time I've checked. But this map here, it does show that at least in the area where Göbekli Tepe is, that there is the haplogroup X, which I believe is passed down from the mother to the daughter. Yeah, maybe the son too, but only the mothers. it's like it stays the same through the women, I think. And I'm not a geneticist at
En,
all. So.
en español le llamamos ADN mitocondrial, que solamente procede, como bien dices, de la madre. Entonces, aquí lo que presentas es que la región de Göbekli Tepe y la región semítica tendrían elementos comparables con una parte del norte de América.
Yeah, he just explained what you mentioned in Spanish. It's the Eve, mitochondrial Eve. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah.
That it's only transmitted from the mother, and that he explained that you explained this relationship that we have in North America of that mitochondrial Eve.
Yeah, exactly. And so there, the haplogroup X appears in the area of Göbekli Tepe densely, as you can see. That brownish color is the most dense that we have on this map, and also occurs in North America, kind of around the North Lakes, pretty densely. It doesn't show South America or Central America, Mexico, but that is really interesting right there. There's another map here which shows the R haplogroup, which is part of the Y DNA, which, to my understanding, comes down through the father to the son. And we see that where Göbekli Tepe is here in the Turkey area it's pretty fairly dense R haplogroup, and that also appears in the Americas. And this one does show some South America as well. And so it's not proof, because obviously there were many migrations since the time of Göbekli Tepe to the Americas. But it is something. It's something to think about, something to consider until we get some more data, right? And interesting with the R haplogroup. This slide is kind of messy. I apologize, but I did find somewhere fairly recently in 2023, where they did sequence some DNA from a specimen from the remains of a human at Navali Kori, which is fairly close to Göbekli Tepe, and it was about the same time period, and it did turn out to be haplogroup R1b. And you know, I'm not a geneticist. I tried to read those messages at that website, and it was all just like a different language to me. So I could be totally wrong, obviously, but it is interesting that the R haplogroup does show up. And again, here's another map kind of showing where in the Americas we see the most R haplogroups.
Bien, antes de pasar a esta continuación, algunos antropólogos y algunos genetistas afirman más bien que la procedencia de esta correspondencia genética entre ambas zonas se daría a través del cruce de ciertos grupos particulares procedentes de Rusia, que se establecerían o cruzarían el estrecho de Bering y se diseminarían particularmente en esta zona del norte de Estados Unidos y de Canadá. Eso por un lado. Por el otro, en América Latina es muy popular la teoría de que los olmecas son los jareditas y que se corresponderían en tiempo con ellos, pero lo que tú presentas es apoya o está más cercana a la tesis de que tanto jareditas como nefitas se hubieran desarrollado en el norte de América y podrían tener más conexión en común que con Mesoamérica. ¿Qué opinas al respecto?
Okay, so he's mentioning two things. He's saying that some geneticists and anthropologists they explain this correspondency that you mentioned of Göbekli Tepe and North America as just people passing through Russia through the, I don't know the word of
Bering Strait.
yeah. That's, and then he asked questions that in Latin America is really famous the theory about that the Jaredites are the Olmecs, because the dates match and everything.
Mhm.
But what you're representing places this in the US. So, what do you think? What's your opinion? Are you proposing that the Book of Mormon occur or happens in North America? Well, in the US specifically.
No, not necessarily. I definitely I have my own opinions about where things took place. It's pretty independent of this theory, though. Essentially, this theory is just, oh, this is where the Jaredites came from. So it is kind of a geography theory, right? The Great Tower is at Göbekli Tepe, right? But as far as once they get to the Americas, it's pretty open. And if you think about how long in the past Göbekli Tepe was, so I would say that if the Jaredites did come from Göbekli Tepe, it was likely 10, 11, maybe 9, 10, 11,000 years ago, right? And the Olmecs, according to my understanding, did fit more in line with the traditional theory of the Jaredites, where they were more like 4,000 years ago and 1,000 years ago, or 4,000, 3,000, 2,000 years ago, about 2000 BC, if I remember correctly, is kind of the Olmec time period, or where it began. And you can correct me if that's wrong. And so, yeah, I've had people tell me, well, the Jaredites are Olmecs, or the Olmecs were the Jaredites, and so your theory can't be true. And logically, that doesn't make sense, because even if the Olmec were Jaredites, and I think they probably were, it doesn't mean that they didn't have ancestors. They would have had ancestors in the Americas somewhere, right? It's not like the Olmecs just sprang out of the dust, or they didn't just appear there magically. They would have had ancestors. And so if we assume that the Jaredites did come over about 10,000 years ago, then they were the ancestors of the Olmec, which makes the Olmec Jaredites as well, technically, right? And so, yeah, I'll mostly stay away from the geography questions, but I do think that if the Jaredites did come from Göbekli Tepe, it is likely that they spread out everywhere, maybe even into South America too. And so, yeah, I don't see that as an issue, but I definitely am open to people's opinions and questions about that, for sure. So hopefully that answers your question, Juan. Okay, so moving on, as I've studied the Book of Ether, I've found that this famous word, Deseret, is kind of a key to understanding a lot of things about it, at least in my opinion, and my theories. And here, just quickly, obviously Deseret is the bees, right? Everyone who knows the Book of Ether will recognize that. And I think it's a similar translation in Spanish. I could be wrong. But we see that in the Americas and in the Book of Ether that we can learn a lot from the bees, or looking into it, and especially that word Deseret. And I'll just briefly mention that Deseret could, excuse me, it could be related to the Egyptian word Deseret. And I think Hugh Nibley popularized this interpretation. I think it was someone else, and unfortunately I don't remember the guy's name who suggested it. But the Deseret actually is the red crown that this Egyptian goddess is wearing right here on the left. And I believe her name is Nate, or Neth, or something like that. Nath, maybe it's Nath. Sorry, which is interesting. It has connections with a goddess. It has connections with Egyptian mythology, and you can also see it kind of has this proboscis, like a bee-like thing coming off of it, which is really interesting. And in the Americas here, we see there's this emphasis on this deity, this Mayan deity, Ah-Muzen-Kab. And this, I believe, is a representation of him. You can see a man that's upside down, and he's falling or descending, and they call him the descending god. And that's interesting. We don't necessarily have to go into that tonight, but here on the right, we have red honey or mad honey, which is a hallucinogenic form of honey, which we'll talk a little bit about. And Venus here has connections to bees, and I believe to the Jaredites, which hopefully we can get to tonight. But anyway, we'll see. Here we go. So this guy who I talked about, who had this theory about Janus at Göbekli Tepe, he also has this theory about a bee cult at Göbekli Tepe, which I just found fascinating, right? Because obviously it was important to the Jaredites to bring bees with them. And for some reason, it never says why, but they thought it was very important to have bees with them. And so did Moroni, because he was the one who included it in his abridgment of the Book of Ether. So this guy, his name is Mark Black, and you can see down here, it's kind of the title of his paper, which I found fascinating. You can look it up and read it for free. He believes that, so this is a pillar, I believe it's the vulture stone. I can't remember the number of the pillar. It's like pillar 43 at Göbekli Tepe or something like that. And it has these animals, and he believes that this animal that's in the red circle is a bee. That there's a lot of debate about that. I think he's the only person I've seen suggest that it's a bee, but he believes that there was a bee cult at Göbekli Tepe, which ultimately caused the demise of Göbekli Tepe, which is just fascinating. And he believes that occurred about 11,000 years ago, or 9,000 BC. And so we can see actually that bees were kind of a big deal. Excuse me. They were kind of a big deal in Anatolia at the time, in the area of Göbekli Tepe. You see this map, we can find Göbekli Tepe here. And we see that there was a bee cult at Göbekli Tepe, according to Mark Black, if he's correct. And in some of these other sites that are close by, we have idols, bee idols, this motif that they're worshiping bees or something like that. At Halan Semi and at Kortik Tepe, they had like a bee fetish, is what the researchers call it. And they had bee ritual objects. And then a little bit more to the west here at Katal Hoyuk, they have a bee goddess that's depicted there. And then in the Mediterranean Sea on this island, Kirokatia, if I'm saying that correct, they have beehive houses. And so I made this just to show that the area, there was something about bees that really captivated these people, these ancient people. And I think that is something that we should consider when we think about this theory of Göbekli Tepe could really be the Great Tower, because there seems to be some connection, this sacred connection to bees. And that of course got me thinking. I wrote a post about this on my blog. I believe I called it something about the brother of Jared being a bee shaman or something like that. I wish I remembered the title, but the theory, I guess, is that rather than the traditional just being a prophet, as we think of like Abraham or Moses, it's possible, if the brother of Jared did live long before those men, that he was more of a shaman. Which, if you look it up, shamanism was the religion for these Neolithic people, and they would have a man who they believed could talk to God or would intercede for them, and he would ask God for things. He would plead on their behalf, and he was kind of like, that was his job, right? And the people stayed away from God. And it's interesting at the very beginning of the Book of Ether, when they realize that the languages are going to be confounded, you'll remember that Jared goes to his brother and he says, "Hey, will you please ask God not to confound our language?" And he goes and does it, and God agrees. And he says, "Well, will you go now and ask that he won't mess with our friends too?" And he asks him like 3 times to pray for him, right? And to pray for his people, which is exactly what a shaman would do back in the day. And if you remember, later on in the story, because the brother of Jared doesn't pray for 4 years, the Lord chastises him, and he teaches him that, hey, you need to teach your people that they need to pray to me too, right? Like, you all need to pray to me. Not me, obviously, but God, right? He's saying this, and it's really interesting. And I wonder if if that's not evidence that he was a shaman of some sorts, which would perhaps place them further back in time than the traditional Tower of Babel time period. But that's just me. But anyway, this mad honey, this red honey right here, this is hallucinogenic honey, which is something that a shaman probably would have been using. You can see that this figure right here has a bunch of mushrooms, which are some psychedelic hallucinogenic properties, obviously. And perhaps this is how he communed with the spiritual world. We don't know. But in this map, in this gray shaded areas, they show where the plants are that you can make this red honey from, this mad honey. And it's called the rhododendron plant. And you can see that Göbekli Tepe is right in a really thick spot where there's a lot of these plants. And actually, according to the Joe Rogan podcast and other sources that I've read, that's like the best place to get mad honey is around the Black Sea, around that area where Göbekli Tepe was. And you note that there's also a pretty good distribution in North America. Again, I'm not saying that that's necessarily where they went, but if that's kind of the method that the brother of Jared was using to commune with God, they definitely went from one place to the other with a bunch of good resources to make mad honey. And you'll notice that here in the red, where the traditional Tower of Babel places are, there does not seem to be much rhododendron to make such hallucinogenic honey. So anyway, any comments or questions about that? Sorry, that was a long stretch there.
I don't have any questions. I don't know, Juan.
Ninguna, es claro. Entonces, esta correspondencia que podíamos encontrar entre el hermano de Jared como un posible chamán de las abejas en esta representación de los chamanes o los sacerdotes asociados con las abejas y con la miel están asociados a la resurrección, al encuentro entre el inframundo y la salvación de los pueblos, sobre todo en la región de Egipto y en algunas zonas de Mesopotamia. Entonces, es interesante la propuesta que aquí haces.
He just mentioned that it's interesting the relation that maybe the brother of Jared was a shaman because the honey and bees are normally related with the resurrection. So he mentioned it's interesting. And I will put,
Sí, de hecho, por ejemplo, en las representaciones egipcias vas a encontrar a quienes llevan esta indumentaria relacionada con la abeja, llevando el signo de Ang, el signo de la muerte y la resurrección, porque tienen el poder de traspasar más allá de la muerte y ayudar a quienes tienen que presentarse ante los dioses para ser juzgados. Entonces, es una figura recurrente.
Okay, so he mentioned that in some Egyptian representations, they are carrying the Ankh, the Ankh?
Yeah.
To help the people to face the gods and resurrection and life that the Ankh represents.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. In my studies of this, I've definitely found that there's a lot of Egyptian names in the Book of Ether, even, and I think there's something there. Not entirely sure what it is, but it's really interesting. Egyptian is definitely a big deal and something to look into for sure. But yeah, so go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, nah, I have a question, a comment that maybe you will answer in the future, but if I understand and what I read on your blog, that probably you're gonna mention it when the bread of Jared sees the hand of God, that you are representing. Well, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that this way that God is revealing in the human history, like little by little, right? Because like here was like brother of Yar was a shaman, that he was only one praying to God, and then like no, teach them that everyone needs to pray with me. And then like this idea of conception of God, like evolving. Is that correct? Or
That's I think that's exactly right. I think the brother Jared's story is so interesting, and I disagree when members of the church say that he was a great prophet, and it's just because of the nuance there, because I don't see him as the same type of prophet as Moses was, right? He forgot to pray for 4 years. I mean, what prophet forgets to pray for 4 years? And what I see is that he was definitely an infantile religious person, if that makes sense. Like he hadn't matured to that level because he just hadn't been taught, right? He knew what he knew, and he was basically the person that spoke to God for his people. And he didn't think that he had to pray probably for 4 years unless someone asked him to, right? He didn't think that his people had to pray to God either. And he seemed to be so astonished when he saw God's hand reaching out, and he's like, "Oh, I didn't know that God had a hand, that he had flesh," right? And it's interesting, back then, like, what you can imagine what their concept of God would have been, right? Is God some formless spirit? Is God in the wind? Is he the bees, which is something I talk about a little bit on the blog? And perhaps, and maybe I'll mention that I think maybe the cloud that they mentioned that the Lord stood in while he talked to the brother Jared was nothing more than a swarm of bees, right? And maybe the bees are what was leading them, and that's how he spoke to them. Maybe he used this hallucinogenic honey, and through that, God used that to speak to him, and he believed he was speaking to a deity within this cloud, right? I don't know. It's just really interesting, and yeah, I think that God, at least, I think that's evidence that it was much further back than we think, because it seems like he's not really on the same kind of caliber as these other Old Testament prophets that we learn about. So,
y yo podría agregar, Javier, antes de pasar a los comentarios, que el relato del libro de Éter es un relato mediado precisamente por Éter, un protagonista que está aquí en América con una cultura muy diferente a la semítica, que está reinterpretando unas historias que él ha recibido de mucho más antes y que las ha plasmado en escritura para su pueblo, pero que es una recopilación de mitos y leyendas y creencias y tradiciones que traen anteriores, y por lo tanto debemos de considerar que cuando el Señor le está hablando al hermano de Jared, está hablándole a una persona del Neolítico, a una cultura tremendamente diferente a la semita o a la que puedas encontrar después entre los pueblos de América, y por lo tanto es una retraducción de ideas e imágenes y leyendas que después nos llegan a nosotros a través del Libro de Mormón, pero que probablemente este encuentro y esas experiencias del hermano de Jared estén muy ajenos a nuestra cultura y muy ajeno a lo que nosotros percibimos como la forma en que Dios hablaría, porque la tenemos en mente como una visión semítica, y el Señor no le habló a Jared en términos semíticos, ni a Jared ni a su hermano. Pues pasaríamos a los comentarios y las preguntas antes de que continuemos.
yeah, give me a sec. So yeah, Juan is mentioning that what we have on the book of Ether, it's already reinterpreted by Ether, that they're like he's reinterpreting histories, stories, sorry, that are like more ancient, and their myths and legends. That when God is speaking with to the brother of Jared, he's speaking to someone on the Neolithic. So that what we have and that it has come to us, it has been reinterpreted, and that it's really that is not related to what we maybe have in our minds, that probably we're thinking it in Semitic terms, like a vision, like Moses or something, but it's something probably way different.
yeah, Yeah, I agree. And I think, oh, sorry. Go
No,
ahead.
that was
Yeah, I agree. I think I mean, if you read the story closely, I think there's definitely some differences there, which I think they deserve some more attention rather than just glossing it over and categorizing the brother of Jared as some Old Testament prophet. I think we should definitely take a closer look. And he's obviously very revered. I think they speak of him very highly later on in the Book of Mormon, right? Like he was a great prophet and he had so much faith. And there's a promise that when the Gentiles repent, have faith like the brother of Jared did, that they'll have all things revealed unto them, or something like that. And if you look at his story, he had great faith that whatever God said was the truth and that God couldn't lie. And I think that's a great key for us to go on as we move forward in our lives. But
perfect. We'll read some comments and some questions that some people have. So I want to go some quickly. He's just saying he's saying hi from Peru.
Hello.
Well, Reyes Suazo, he's suggesting that you should have spoken Portuguese because it's similar to Spanish.
I don't know. I've kind of lost a lot of it, so I'm not sure it'd be intelligible at this point. So,
Luis Valdez, he's saying hi from Catamarca, Argentina, and he's asking how much influence does Sumeria or the Babel region has the Book of Ether and the modifications that the Book of Mormon affect the story, the telling.
Good question. I'm definitely not an expert on that and the Sumerian influence, but I do know that there's a researcher named Jerry Grover, and he has written a lot of books about the Book of Ether, and he shows that there are a lot of Sumerian names in the Book of Ether, or at least you can find some really good meanings for names, some really good etymologies of names from Jaredite names. And so some might see that and say, well, then it has to date to the time of Sumeria, which was probably around 3000 BC, or 4000, 3000 BC. So a lot later than the Göbekli Tepe. And I would argue against that and say, well, I mean, it is possible that other migrations came over to the Americas after the Jaredites came. And I think there's even evidence for that if you read closely the Book of Ether. And so, we actually don't know how many groups of people came over, and there's no way of knowing until obviously it's revealed to us. But I do think there's evidence that there were other groups, and there probably is some influence there from Sumeria. I just can't speak too much on that. Sorry.
Thank you. Fabian is asking how should we understood the story of Babel, as a myth, as a historical fact, or as a combination between both?
Yeah, good question. I think looking at it as a combination of both is probably the best way to go. Especially like biblical scholars will say, and even a lot of anti-Mormons will use biblical scholarship and say, well, the story of the Tower of Babel wasn't written until 500 BC, right? And so, but it shows up in the Book of Mormon, and so that means the Book of Mormon is false because Joseph Smith didn't know when the Tower of Babel story was written. But obviously, we've pointed out that the word Babel is never actually used in the Book of Mormon, and so it does open it up for there being an older tower, or an older myth, or an older legend, or an older truth that there was a great tower, and that the Tower of Babel is just kind of a corrupted version of that story. So I think there was something to do with language. I'm not sure it was as simple as we think, where it's just like a snap of the fingers and everyone was speaking a different language. Maybe it was some type of invasion, or maybe God said like, hey, I'm going to drive you guys out of here and you're going to have to go speak with other people. And so you're going to lose your language. I don't know how it worked, but I do think that there's truth in that story. I just wouldn't take everything at 100% face value.
Thank you. Neil Jean Louis. He's saying, "Good night. I saw a documentary about the construction of the pyramids that was talking about an hypothesis about Egyptians traveling to this continent thousands of years before Christopher Columbus. Uh, I don't know if he's asking or just saying, but he said this has to do with the uh, how do you say rastros, the leftovers that the Nephites found.
Oh yeah, okay.
And he's saying that the documentary it's called K18 2019, The Great Pyramid.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I'm definitely not the person to talk to about Egyptian influence, but I've got a friend named Lance Weaver who he has a website called it's gatheredin.one. And he has all sorts of theories and evidence to back it up, and he has a really cool Book of Mormon geography theory. But in all of that, he shows how there probably was a big influence in Egyptians in America, or the Americas, including Mexico, especially around the time when the Nephites would have gotten there. And it may have to do with other Israelites coming over to the Americas, like not Lehi, not the Mulekites, but other Israelites that came a little bit before them, who would have had also an Egyptian influence. And also, there were big copper mines by the Great Lakes up in the United States area. And it's very possible that the Egyptians and other groups came over to exploit those resources. Egypt, I believe, is known for using a lot of copper tools. And the copper in the Americas supposedly was the best that they could find, is what I've heard. I'm not an expert on it, but I do think that there was some type of Egyptian influence. And I think the story of the migrations to the Americas is much more complex than the scientists want to admit, and more complex than the Book of Mormon presents. I do think there's a lot of evidence in the Book of Mormon itself that there were other people there and other migrations, but it doesn't come out and say it, and so we don't ever talk about it, right? But I do think that evidence is there. So yeah, I think there's something to look at for sure.
Sylvia Estrada, she says, so they are not a Semitic people. They are not Semitic people. The Jaredites. Yeah. What town? What? It's because it's not a word in English. What people would they be?
So is she asking if they were not Semitic, who would they be? Is that what she's asking?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah, and there's a lot of people who would say that Jared and the brother of Jared were sons of Ham, or one of the sons of Noah, or something like that. And it's possible, and it's possible also that Noah lived much further back in the past than we think. And so maybe we'll talk about that if we get there. But I do believe that there were some what you would call Semitic Jaredites, and it doesn't really have much to do with my theory about Göbekli Tepe, but I do believe that there were other Israelites coming over before Lehi got here, and they would have mixed with the Jaredites. And even there's evidence of this if you look in Ether chapter 13. Ether is giving a speech. He's giving a sermon to the people, and he starts talking about Joseph of Egypt, and he starts talking about the house of Israel and Jerusalem and all this. And if he talks about it like those people know who he's talking about. But if the Jaredites were just pure, like non-Semitic people at that point in time, which would have been what I think would have been about 600 BC, right before Lehi got there. If they were not Semitic, then they shouldn't have known who Joseph of Egypt was. They shouldn't have known about the Israelites at all, right? And so I think that there probably were groups that were related to the Israelites, or were actually Israelites. And I think that there's evidence of that as people in North America find like Semitic things, and even in Mexico, South America, I think that they were all over the place. Another evidence, sorry, real quick, would be Sherem in Jacob chapter 7, where he comes to Jacob, and it seems like he's not really a Nephite, but he lives the law of Moses, and he accuses Jacob of blasphemy and not living the law of Moses. And it's like, well, where did this guy come from, right? Like, if he was related to Jacob, he'd be like his nephew or his son or something. And so, yeah, I think there were other Israelites there, and I think that the Jaredites really did spread out, probably in both North and South Americas and everywhere in between. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question. I don't know if it did, but
Thank you. Luis Valdez, he's asking, the names and the words in the book of Ether, do they have a meaning?
yeah. So I have looked at a lot of names. I actually have a slide about this. Let me just see if I can find it real quick. Sorry to tease everybody with these pictures, but yeah, sorry. I love etymology, which is the study of words and names, right? And I've been trying to take a deep dive into the names of the Book of Ether for a couple of years now, and I do think they have a lot of meanings. What I found is that we have a lot of Egyptian names, and you have a lot of Semitic names, like that would have been Hebrew or maybe even Egyptian, because Egyptian is kind of a Semitic language, right? But we also find some Chinese names, at least I think so, which is really interesting. And perhaps even some like Gaelic or Celtic names, which is really interesting to me. But anyway, this is kind of a chart that I made that kind of shows these icons of like what these names kind of mean. And I found a lot of names that might mean lion, which is fascinating to me. As you can see, I have these little lions everywhere. And I have a lot of names that might mean like a queen or a goddess, or some that have to do with bees and trees and hills or mountains, the number 8. So I don't know, take a screenshot of that, look at it. It's kind of a rough draft of things, but I do think that the names, even in the whole Book of Mormon, they're just like a gold mine. So if you look into the names, you'll find a lot of information there. Ether, the name Ether itself, I think, is one of the most amazing names in the Book of Mormon. So yeah, does that answer the question? I hope.
Sí, y también en su blog, él también nos presenta algunas propuestas para el nombre de Éter y por qué tendría este nombre en especial el profeta. Y entonces es interesante la manera que él aborda algunos de estos nombres. Sobre la pregunta anterior, la construcción de los semitas como tal, aunque los babilónicos son semitas, desde mi punto de vista particular, los Jareditas y sus gente no serían pueblos semitas, serían otro tipo de pueblos.
He's mentioning, well, first of all, he mentioned that in your blog you have some entries about the meaning of the name of Ether that are really interesting. So he's inviting them to go and read them. He's giving his opinion on this question. In his opinion, the people from Babylonia may have been Semitic, but the Jaredites, for him, they date way before. So for him, it would be a different people.
Yeah. And can you hear me? Sorry. Yeah. One of the things to remember too about the names is that the Book of Ether is a translation of an older document, right? And so as Moroni or Mosiah, whoever it was that translated those names, it's very possible that a lot of them were translated from like a Hebrew or a Semitic origin, because that's kind of the language that Mosiah spoke. It's possible that they could be a completely different, unrelated language. We just can't know. It is interesting that the names do seem that they have these different origins, like ether, right? Like if you read what I've written about ether, the name ether, I think it could have a Greek or a Latin origin. It may even, I haven't written this, but it could have like a Gaelic origin. We just can't really know like what language the translation came out as, if that makes sense. And we can't, like the name Jared, for example, was there a guy 10,000 years ago named Jared? I don't know, unlikely, but it is possible that he was called Jared by Mosiah or whoever translated the book, because Jared means to descend. And what did the Jaredites do? They descended, they came down from the tower and they came to the Americas, right? And also as a people, they fell and they descended basically into hell because they wouldn't repent. And so there's a lot of cool things you can learn from these names. And I wouldn't put 100% stock in like, oh, this is a Sumerian name, so it means that the Jaredites were Sumerian, or that they're Semitic, so it means that they're Semitic. I would just have some careful nuance with that, and just keep that in the back of your mind that it may not exactly be what it appears to be.
And I think you have to have also in consideration the Joseph Smith translation, no? Like how he did it, like it was like word by word. It was just like taking ideas, interpretation. So you have another layer of interpretation there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, good point.
Luis Valdez is asking, do we know what was the motivation of the people of that region to build Göbekli Tepe? Those the reasons are similar to what we have on the Tower of Babel, like as we found it in Genesis?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't think we know exactly, and I'm speaking for the archaeologist, right? I'm not an archaeologist, but I don't think we know exactly why they built it. But it does appear to be aligned to certain constellations at the time that it was in session, or whenever they were using it. I believe it's Andrew Collins is a pretty famous guy who's looked into this, and he has discovered that it seemed to be like you see it from this map that it was aligned to the north, which is interesting when you consider that the Valley of Nimrod was to the north. But anyway, it was aligned to the north, and it seemed to maybe have been aligned with the constellation Deneb, or the star Deneb, or something like that. And I've read some other things where it seemed to be aligned with the rise of Sirius, the star Sirius from the horizon. So I'm not sure, but that seems to be a focus on the heavens, which to the shamanistic people obviously was a big deal. Like that was part of their religion, right? We don't do much of that nowadays, but back then it was. And it does appear from these big T-pillars in the middle that there was some kind of worship going on. And it's interesting that we have we've talked about this pagan, like this connection to these pagan religions, like the Greek myths and the Egyptian myths and all that. And if you remember from the Tower of Babel, it seemed to be that they were building this tower to get to heaven, right? They were trying to use it to get to heaven without doing the work, so to speak, of being saved by God themselves, right? Without having to repent. At least that's the way I see it. And so if we find these kind of pagan things in Göbekli Tepe, we can kind of draw a connection to the Tower of Babel, where if Göbekli Tepe was a place where people were trying to reach the afterlife, or trying to, in effect, save themselves, then that kind of fits, right? Because they were trying to get to heaven through what they built, instead of trying to get to heaven through God, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Sirius asking, does the Jaredite found the Göbekli Tepe, or they came out of there, or this place already existed, or only the Jaredites found them through their way to the promised land?
Good question. I think that the Jaredites would have originated from this area of Göbekli Tepe. They're beginning to discover more sites similar to Göbekli Tepe in the general region. And if we look at this picture here, I've kind of cut off part of it, but every place where there's like this big black T, that's a site that's kind of similar to Göbekli Tepe, where they find big T pillars, which were used for some kind of religious purpose, right? And they don't really find evidence of like cities there, but this was a long time ago. So the people, and they likely were nomads or hunter gatherers, and so may have lived in sort of tents, and they would have moved around and stuff probably. And so I think they originated from that location, and for some reason God was telling them to leave, and the brother of Jared just so happened to be led to the Americas, and that's the kind of the origin story of the Americas, and that's why it was so important to the Nephites and the Lamanites. So hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you. Neil says that thank you very much. I'm really satisfied with the answer.
Okay, thank you.
And Luis Valdez is like, I don't know if it's a good time to ask my question, but does this center of worship of the Jaredites, could they be base of what they have on Göbekli Tepe? Sorry so much for my questions, but I'm really curious about what you were saying.
Yeah, no worries. So let me see if I understand the question correctly. Did the Jaredites base their worship on Göbekli Tepe? Is that the question?
With what they had on Göbekli Tepe.
Okay. Yeah. So we don't actually know too much about how the Jaredites worshipped, because if you read the Book of Ether, it really doesn't talk too much about religion. It's really like a bunch of wars and kings falling and kings taking over and putting other kings in captivity and stuff. And really the only religion you get is at the beginning and near the end. You do have episodes where the prophets will come forth and they'll tell the people they need to repent or they'll be destroyed. And there's actually several places where there are big destructions among the Jaredites. So yeah, we don't really know too much about how they worshipped. But if you look at the Americas, obviously, and especially North America, because I'm not too familiar with how it is south of where I live, but the Native Americans up here obviously kind of have a shamanistic religion, which would have resembled probably pretty closely what the people 10,000 years ago in Göbekli Tepe would have kind of been living, like some kind of shamanistic thing, as we've talked about. Yeah, as far as like from the Book of Mormon, I can't really answer that, but I think there's evidence that there's probably some similarities between some of the shamanistic aspects of religion in the Americas and even South America and Göbekli Tepe. And one interesting thing, I don't have a slide about this, but I think it's in Colombia. I made a list, and there's the word for shaman among the Colombian tribes is pretty much the same word as jaguar among the Colombian tribes. And one of the meanings for the name Mahanrai Moriankamer, which you may know is what Joseph Smith revealed the brother of Jared's name to be, one of those meanings might have to do with a leopard or a lion or a jaguar. So it is possible that there's some carryover there, that the brother of Jared was like the father shaman of these people, and it just kind of carried on, and now they call their shamans jaguar because their father was named Jaguar, if that makes sense.
Jacob, is there a relationship between the colossal Olmeca heads with Göbekli Tepe?
Sí, Ryan en su blog precisamente tiene a comparación de algunas representaciones de la cultura olmeca con respecto a Göbekli Tepe, pero dejemos que nos comente.
He's mentioned that you have already also some entries on your blog between the relationship, some similarities between the Olmec culture with Göbekli Tepe.
Yeah, I do. As far as the giant, sorry, as far as the giant heads go, I'm not sure there's much relation there, other than it does appear that there was some sort of like a skull cult at Göbekli Tepe where they were cutting people's heads off and they were displaying them even in these enclosures for whatever reason. Some people think it was because some people think it was their grandmother would die, and so they'd cut her head off and they'd like hang it and just hopefully that like her spirit would go to the afterlife or something. Some people think it was more of like a secret combination thing where they were actually murdering people and like showing their heads and being like, you better stay away from us or something like that. So I don't know. I mean, there's head stuff there that could be related. But let me get to the slide here. There's one interesting thing here where this is pillar 43, which we've talked a little bit about. And you see that there's these handbag symbols. It kind of looks like a suitcase or a briefcase, something like that. And that does show up in this Olmec sculpture from La Venta, which dates to about 1200 BC. You see this guy's holding a handbag. And now this handbag appears in other places around the world too, in Sumeria, maybe Babylonia somewhere. I don't remember all the places, but it's an interesting connection there. And if it is connected, obviously, it's like, well, how did these people in the Americas, how did the Olmecs get this idea of this handbag, and that which also appears in Göbekli Tepe? It's definitely something that you need to ask in order to really figure out what was going on. So I'm not sure, but that's one of the things that shows up in both places.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And the last question, well, he's asking when are we going to put it in Spanish. We don't have a specific date because we'll have to translate a lot.
Lo siento. Yo no hablo español.
But as soon as we can.
Yeah.
Jacobo says thank you.
Oh, thank you.
And yeah, you can continue.
Continue? Okay, yeah. Or how are we doing on time? Do we?
Oh, well, I mean, depends on you. Like, if you
Okay.
want, we can do a second part, or we can.
Well, yeah. No, I'm okay. I'm okay going as long as you guys are. But I'll try to pick up the pace a little bit. I'm kind of a slow talker, so if you need to stop me, ask a question, raise your hand or something, and let me know. Otherwise, I'll just kind of keep going. Okay.
Sure.
So yeah, so here on this map we have Göbekli Tepe here in the yellow marker there, and in the book of Ether, as you read it in chapter 2, it talks about that they travel in the wilderness and they get to the sea, and it doesn't say much about the sea. It just says that the Lord didn't want them to stop at the sea or beyond the sea. So either they crossed the sea and the Lord said, "Oh, you got to keep going," or maybe they got to the sea and He said, "You need to cross this and keep going." We don't know. But obviously, the Black Sea is a big candidate for this, and also the Caspian Sea. I wouldn't necessarily say that the Mediterranean Sea is a candidate, although it could be. It just doesn't seem to fit as well in my mind, because they could have just kept going on the ocean, right? They could have just kept going from there to the Americas, and so why would they stop, and where would they stop if they went on the Mediterranean Sea? I think probably the Black Sea is more likely, but again, we don't know. But it's just interesting that how close the Göbekli Tepe is to these two giant seas. In the same part of the book of Ether, it talks about how they built barges, they built boats, and they crossed a lot of waters before they got to the sea. And so, as you see this map here in the bottom right, here's Göbekli Tepe, and there is definitely a lot of water right there for them to cross. if they were to go northward. And remember, the Lord told them to meet in the Valley of Nimrod, which was north of wherever they were. And so they already were going north to begin with. And so it is likely perhaps they just kept going north. And that would have taken them right to the Black Sea, which again was full of this mad hallucinogenic honey, if that's kind of the route we want to go. But it's really interesting. And we already talked about a place called Navali Kori, where they found some DNA. And this place is right by this river called Kantara. And according to some etymology work that someone has done, in Sanskrit, Kantara means wilderness or a path. And it's really interesting that the Lord tells them to go into the wilderness. Like he literally says that, to go forth into the wilderness. So it's just an interesting parallel there that perhaps maybe a clue. We don't know. I'm not saying it's evidence or proof or anything, but it's just interesting. Sorry, I should have remembered this slide when we talked about names. But I was looking at the names of Jared, so the brother of Jared, and he has 4 sons, and they actually named these sons, which is kind of rare. And if you look at the meaning of their names, it kind of could point you to Göbekli Tepe. And actually, what's the most cool about it is it kind of makes a story, and it kind of makes the story of the Jaredites. And so in the order that they're mentioned, you have Jakom, which means let the Lord rise up, and then Gilgal, which might have to do with the circle of stones. That one's kind of fuzzy, but Göbekli Tepe was literally a circle of stones. So that's interesting. And then Maha could mean crush, wild things, or anything. And so I'll just let, I guess I'll read it real quick. When you put all of those names together, it kind of makes the story of the Jaredites. And it says, let the Lord rise up at the sacred hill with the circle of stones, perhaps Göbekli Tepe. The people at the tower are crushed, they're cut down, and they're mixed with others. With Mahanrai at the head, we leave the secret works, and we take with us honeybees and snatch birds and fish and snares and go into the wilderness where the Lord is hidden in a cloud. The Lord is our light as we travel to the promised land. And if you remember, the Lord gives them light to cross the ocean. So that's pretty cool. I recommend everybody to look into the names and all over the Book of Mormon. It just opens up another layer of understanding. It's really awesome. So yeah, elephants is a big one.
Sí, un comentario nada más.
Yeah.
Esta es una de las críticas que generalmente se le hacen al libro mormón, de qué hacen los elefantes citados allí. A veces causa risa, a veces hay otros que tratan de ver elefantes en las pirámides mayas o en representaciones de los mismos. Entonces, al retrotraer un poco en el tiempo a los Jareditas, podemos resolver en una forma interesante la cuestión de los elefantes. Y por cierto, se han encontrado muchísimos restos de mamut de forma muy abundante en lo que iba a ser el aeropuerto de Texcoco, y donde recientemente se ha levantado un museo de los mamuts, porque hay muchísimos.
Give me a sec. I have to take my notes because if not, I forget everything he says.
I understand.
So he's saying that this is one of the most common things that people criticize about the Book of Mormon. That what the heck are elephants doing there? And some try to see these elephants in some Mayan pyramids. And he mentions that a way maybe to solve this is to go back with the Jaredites. And he mentioned it like a interesting fact that there have been found a lot of mammoths, rest of mammoths. Well, a lot of skeletons of mammoths in what was supposed to be the new airport of Texcoco, and they found and they created a museum with all these skeletons.
Yeah.
And also this is a side note, this is what he mentioned, but there's also one subway station, it's called Talisman in Mexico City, which also it's a mammoth, because and you go and you see that they found a mammoth, a skeleton mammoth there when they were building the subway in there. It's a cool fact. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, yeah. I've heard about the airport one. I followed that a little bit when that happened, and I've looked into that a little. But yeah, and I'll show a map here on the next slide of some of the remains of elephants that they found in the Americas. But yeah, this is a huge one when you believe that the Jaredites came over 4,000 years ago or in 2000 BC, and they had elephants, or they worked with elephants, or they hunted them, whatever they did with them, they lived alongside them. It's really hard to square that with what science says about elephants in the Americas or mammoths, because according to scientists, the elephants died out between 13,000 and 10,000 years ago, which is a lot, like way further in the past than 4,000 years ago, right? This is like, we're talking about 6,000 years where there weren't really mammoths, and then all of a sudden the Jaredites have them. So that's one of the issues with the common interpretation of this story. Whereas in my model, when they come from Göbekli Tepe around 11,000 years ago, the elephants are still there. And so that's a big deal, right? And obviously there's more than just that, but I think this is one of the biggest things. And yes, it is possible that elephants could have, or some of these mammoths could have survived much longer than we know. Obviously, we can't find every single fossil. We don't know the whole story. But if they were going to find elephants in abundance, it does appear that around the same time as Göbekli Tepe is when it would have been. So it's a big deal. Here's a map that I found of all of the Proboscidea, or elephant relatives, in America, where they found remains. And I don't know if the ones that you talked about were on here. Maybe there's one close to Mexico City there, but yeah, they're just all over the place, and even into Central America. And so they definitely were here. It's just a matter of when, and most of these, if you click on them, they kind of date to 11,000 years or so and beyond, like older. Some of them might get down to like 9,000 years, maybe even 7,000 years, but it's really tough. I don't know if you'd find one that they have dated to about 4,000 years ago. So it's one of the big things. And also, of course, the scripture talks about, along with elephants, it talks about these animals called curlams and cumams, and we don't know what those are. Obviously, Joseph Smith didn't have a word for it, right? Or else he probably would have translated it to be what it was. But here's some possible candidates for what these would have been. We have like giant armadillos, Glyptodon. We have horses. He probably would have known what a horse was. But I think maybe it was something like a sloth, like a giant sloth, or a Glyptodon, or just something like that, which again went extinct about 10,000 years ago. And so I don't know. That's just something to think about when we think about the Jaredites. One interesting thing is that back then, like in the Neolithic period, about 10,000 years ago or so, human beings were on average taller than they are today, right? And it's really interesting that the Jaredites seem to be presented as this, like a big people, like they're giants almost. And so that's another possible evidence that these people are much older than we think, that they probably didn't come over. They probably didn't come over here about 2000 BC, but probably more like 10,000 BC. So anyway, here I've got like kind of a timeline of how I kind of see maybe this whole thing played out. Around 10,800 BC, we had a possible impactor, like an asteroid or a comet or something, striking the ice sheet in North America, and that caused catastrophic mega floods. I don't know if you guys listen to Joe Rogan at all, but he has people on his show all the time that talk about Younger Dryas period, where there were just cataclysms all over North America because something hit and melted the ice super fast. I think maybe this could have been Noah's flood. It's possible that Noah was based in America, and it's possible that that was the destruction known as Noah's flood. And we don't have to really get into that, but that fits the time period because that is before Göbekli Tepe was constructed. It was about 800 years later Göbekli Tepe was constructed, and then about 2,000 years later it was abandoned, and maybe the Jaredites arrived a little bit before it was abandoned. We don't know, or maybe about the same time. And after that we have the extinction of mammoths in North America. Around 7,000 BC there was a huge solar storm, and that might align with this dearth of Heth, which is mentioned, I believe, in either 9 or 10. It talks about like a big drought and all the animals die and they start to go into the land southward. And so people eat all the animals, and like that could be talking about elephants, and who knows what happened. But solar storms can be pretty gnarly, and there was a huge one, according to science, there was a huge one about that time. And so I wonder if those line up. And then after that, we have the deserts, like the Chihuahua and then the Sonoran Desert drying up, which fits kind of that dearth idea. And then here in the red, you see, well, this is when they think like the traditional date for the flood of Noah, it's much later. And the traditional date for the Tower of Babel, it's much later. And so, I don't know. To me, I feel like the Göbekli Tepe stuff fits a lot better with the evidence that we have. But you make your own decision on those.
Entonces, aquí como comentario, lo que nos propone Ryan en su hipótesis es que al retrotraer este tiempo hacia finales del Pleistoceno, casi hace 11,000 años, podríamos encuadrar algunas cosas que están aconteciendo en América y que podrían corresponderse en ese sentido. El detalle, el aspecto interesante de este fin del Pleistoceno en América, y por eso nos hemos referido a la cuestión de los elefantes, es que, por ejemplo, en la zona de Tocuila, en la zona de Texcoco, en la zona de Atenco, donde se ha trabajado en estos yacimientos, se encontraron la zona más grande de osamentas de mamut, pero no solamente de mamut, sino tenemos también restos de caballos, de aves, de camellos americanos, de felinos, de bisontes, de conejos, tortugas, de otro tipo de especies que están concentradas en esta región y que permiten hacer esta concordancia entre lo que los jareditas están definiendo como parte de los animales que traen o encuentran, y pues esta manera de correr las fechas permite entonces darle una explicación o un mayor sentido a estas cuestiones. Entonces estaríamos hablando del final de la última glaciación. Hay muchas inundaciones. Con esto también Ryan trata de explicar el fenómeno del diluvio de Noé, y con la salida del Valle de la Muerte y en los Jareditas llegar aquí a América, mientras que se siguen desarrollando episodios y replicaciones de este mito fundacional que es la Torre de Babel. Los Jareditas ya estarían aquí, y en este fin del Pleistoceno, en estos últimos periodos de glaciación, sí es posible encontrar los mamuts, los camellos, los caballos en estas tierras de América.
Okay. So he's mentioned that what you propose is that these dates, we could make that these events match, because of what he mentioned, that all these remains that they found on the airport, that it has been the biggest zones where mammoths were found, but they were not only mammoths, they were horses, birds, camels, American camels, turtles, and more animals that allow us to make this match between what the Jaredites mentioned that it's their fauna, and that you're talking about the last, I don't know if this is a word, glaciation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the word. Okay.
Mhm.
And that with that you explain the flood, the Noah flood, and that's why if we move these dates like 11,000 years before, we can make sense of what the Jaredites mention.
Yeah. Yeah, and thank you, Juan, for mentioning like the camels and the horses. That's another thing um, that I had forgot to mention. That it's not just elephants that don't fit the normal timeline, the traditional timeline with the Tower of Babel. It's also the things like horses, which are mentioned, and it's possible that Kirlans and Kamans have some sort of connection to like the American camel or stuff like that. And so again, those things are extinct, and they were been extinct for a very long time, which, according to science, predates those things. And um, so, yeah, I was going to say something else, but I forgot. Anyway, um, let's let's go on. Oh, that's what it was. So you guys live so you mentioned this these sites where they find mammoth bones in Mexico. And I wonder, have any of them been found like in pits? So what I mean by that is, were the ancient people of Mexico, were they making like trap pits to trap mammoths in? Like where the mammoths would fall into the pit and die, and then they'd go in and like eat the mammoth. Are any of these remains that they're finding in anything like that? Like a big hole?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know if you, Juan. No.
You don't know? Yeah, I asked that because there is an interesting passage in the book of Ether where I think it's in Ether 9, or during about the same time period of Heth, where the prophets come and they tell them to repent because they're going to be destroyed. And then Heth has them thrown into pits. Like you've used that word. I wish I remember the reference, but I'm not sure what it is. But anyway, I just wondered if there were if they were perhaps mammoth hunting pits, which again would be another, if they could date those pits, that'd be another evidence to show like what was going on and when the Jaredites lived. So anyway, another cool thing is that W. Phelps is a pretty big name in Mormon history, and he in 1832 he wrote that the Jaredites had this geographical range between the Rocky Mountains and the Mississippi River. And again, like I'm not necessarily promoting this as a geography, but it's interesting that this is the exact same territory of what Wikipedia says that the Folsom tradition of Native Americans was, and they lived about 11,000 BC. Around that time period that the Jaredites would have been coming over. And so it's just another interesting thing to think about. Perhaps they were associated with this culture, or perhaps they are this culture. We don't know exactly, but it seems to fit this where W. Phelps heard this information. Perhaps he heard it from Joseph. We don't know, but it's just really interesting. Yeah, there's this place called Bull Brook, again, which is another geographical site, but this was pointed out to me by Lance Weaver, who I mentioned earlier. There's a site in, I think it's modern day Maine in the United States, where it's a pretty good fit for where Ablom would have been, and I think that's talked about in Ether. Yeah, sorry, I don't remember the chapters, probably Ether 7 or 8. And this is place where Omer, he's the king, and he is his kingdom is being taken over. So he gets out of there and he goes east and he goes to this place on the seashore. And if you look into it, it's a pretty good site for this Ablon place in the Book of Mormon. And the cool thing about it is that it was occupied. So when it would have been occupied was about 11,000 years ago, which is right like smack dab when it would have been if they had come over from Göbekli Tepe. So that's an interesting thing to think about. Here is a map that kind of shows where.
Una pequeña pausa nada más para que se den una idea quienes nos escuchen y vean. Y para recordar un poco lo que pudieron haber visto en bachillerato, la cultura de Folsom corresponde al área de la parte norteamericana central. Es una zona arqueológica paleoamericana y está datada lo que se ha encontrado ahí entre el 9000 y el 8000 más o menos antes de Cristo. Es destacable las puntas de proyectil que se desarrollaron en esta zona y muchas culturas antiguas o paleoindígenas de América del Norte ocuparon esta zona de las grandes llanuras y los grandes lagos en lo que ahora es Estados Unidos y Canadá, y la cultura Folsom es precisamente destacable por su tipo de proyectiles, por sus estrategias como pueblos cazadores, recolectores, y por los diversos utensilios que se han encontrado en los yacimientos, que igual implica la crianza de cabras, de marmotas, de ciervos y de conejos. Y el yacimiento original, y por eso se llama cultura de Folsom, se encuentra en lo que ahora es Nuevo México, y en algunos sitios de México hay prolongaciones hasta el altiplano, hasta central, pero mayormente en lo que es Chihuahua, parte de Coahuila, etcétera, podemos encontrar la influencia de la cultura de Folsom. Ryan es, en ese sentido, apoya más la teoría de que los hechos del Libro de Mormón debieron haber ocurrido en la zona de lo que ahora es Norteamérica, en esa zona de los grandes lagos y de las grandes llanuras de Estados Unidos y Canadá, en su región central.
Okay, so well, he just give like a general context about the Folsom culture that dates normally between 9,000 to 8,000 before Christ, and yeah, that they expand between the U.S. And what it's Canada today, and they were people that they recollect they were hunters, and some parts they expand to what is Mexico, to Chihuahua and some states there. And he's mentioning that in that sense you support more that the events of the Book of Mormon happen in that area, the Folsom area, that it's USA and Canada.
I wouldn't. Yeah, there's a lot of nuance with Book of Mormon geography as far as I'm concerned. Again, like, this is independent of this theory about when the Jaredites came or where they came from, but what I kind of see when I read the Book of Mormon is that the Jaredites, at least especially when they ended, when they were destroyed, that a lot of that was kind of more North America. I wouldn't say necessarily like Canada, but it is interesting that the gold plates were found in North America, in New York, right? The hill Cumorah, which is what is known as, and when Moroni writes the Book of Ether, he talks about, like, right at the very beginning, he talks about how he is going to write about the people that were destroyed in this land north, or what, something like that, right? And so I do support that. Like, the main bulk of them were probably in North America as far as Jaredites go, but that doesn't necessarily translate to the Nephites, right? I think the Nephites were probably more in Mexico. And I'm also informed a lot by this Lance Weaver's work on that. I think his theory is fascinating, and I agree with a lot of it. And so I see kind of like it's instead of me saying like, oh, I'm a Heartlander or I'm a Mesoamerican, I kind of can see both, because I do feel like a lot of times in the Book of Mormon, when they're talking about the Nephites, there's like this land northward that has been destroyed, and it's called the land desolation. Like they don't go there much. There are groups that do go up there, but we don't really hear their stories, right? And like the prophet Nephi, not the first Nephi, but the one in the book of Helaman, it says that he goes up to the land northward and he's gone for like 7 years, and then he comes back. And like, you know, like that, for me, that just doesn't feel like it would be like in a small area. If like that land northward was in a really small area, I don't know. He wouldn't take him. He wouldn't be gone for 7 years. I don't know. Like there's a bunch of things like that. And so I do kind of see the Jaredites in like even the days of Ether. I'm kind of leaning towards that he was in North America, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all of the Jaredites were there, right? And especially when that dearth of Heth happened, which we talked about. So like the whole drying up of everything. It talks about how the people start to migrate south, right? And so there definitely were, in my opinion, there were definitely Jaredites that went south into Mexico and maybe even to South America. And I think after the dearth was kind of went away, people started to move back up north. As again, there were large, very large copper mines up by the Great Lakes, and they date to a really good time period for the Jaredites. And I don't think that they would have just abandoned those, right? And I think we're looking at a lot more people than we probably think, and a lot more different communities. But I classify them all as Jaredites because they're descendants from Jared. So,
have you read the theory of Mark Allen Wright? Is Heartland as hinterland the Mesoamerican core and North American periphery of the Book of Mormon geography? He kind of proposes that.
Yeah, that sounds familiar, and it's probably something similar to that is what we call that. Lance Weaver, his theory is called, I believe, something about like the Mexican highland or something. It's really interesting, and he'd be one that to have on your show for sure. And he might even speak Spanish. I don't know. But if he does, that'd be awesome. But he basically, like, he sees the land of Zarahemla as being kind of Cholula, which I think is kind of close to Mexico City, if I'm not mistaken. Kind of close.
An hour and a half.
Yeah. But you know, he also leaves it open for like the Jaredites and a lot of communities of Nephites that move northward to be in North America, and I think it fits pretty well. I'm not an expert on the geography side for sure, but that's kind of how I lean. I'm not ready to say like, oh, it all happened in North America or it all happened in Mesoamerica. I think for me, it just makes more sense that it's kind of more spread out, especially between Mexico and the Great Lakes. Like I can kind of see that whole area as being represented in the Book of Mormon.
Okay.
Yeah. So Bullbrook, let's go back to that real quick. So this might be a good site for Ablom, and I just throw it in there because it dates to a good time. It seems that it could fit, you know, if you are willing to see like North America as at least part of that, as a viable location for that time period in the Book of Mormon, in the Book of Ether, which is pretty early on, actually. It's pretty early on in their history when this event occurs. And so just something to consider there. The name Abenaki is the name of the tribe there, and it obviously kind of sounds like the Ab, Lam, and apparently the Ab means east, and these people were on the east, and that's exactly the direction that Omer went when he went to Ablam, was to the east. So it's really some interesting connections there. But yeah, I think now we'll kind of transition a little bit into the Book of Abraham real quick, which kind of seems like wouldn't have anything to do with it. But it's interesting that the Book of Abraham gives us some names of some locations, and the story of Abraham might have something to do with Göbekli Tepe actually, because, well, first Abraham, in chapter 1, he talks about this place called Olishem, right? And there is actually a pretty good candidate spot for this location, because they found a city that used to be called Ulisim, and it's fairly close to Göbekli Tepe. It's probably more than 100 miles away. You can see on this map, you'd have on the bottom right, you'd have Oliem or Olisem in this big black dot, and then I've circled where Göbekli Tepe was in red, and that city Urfa is right there. So it's pretty close, but obviously it could have been a place if Abraham was from the area close to Göbekli Tepe, which is a possibility. It's definitely a place that he could have gone to, and that was the place where they offered up sacrifices to pagan gods, which is interesting. And yeah, let's go back to where Göbekli Tepe is. So you see in the top left, there's kind of a map here where it shows the Haran Plain. And in the top left of that map, there's a place called Sanli Urfa, or Urfa, sometimes it's called. And Göbekli Tepe is pretty close. You can see where that is right there. And in the book of Abraham, it talks about how he left the land of Ur, which could be Urfa, which is basically the land of where Göbekli Tepe was. And he went down into the land he stopped in a place called Haran. And there's literally this place called the Haran Plain, which is just south of Göbekli Tepe. And it's lush. It's not necessarily, I mean, there'd be a lot of animals there, just like what it says in the book of Abraham, where they went there to escape the famine. And then on the right, there's a bigger map here, and it kind of could show a possible route of where Abraham went from, originating pretty much from Göbekli Tepe down into what we know as Jerusalem area now. So interesting connections there, especially if we think of the Tower of Babel as being like a big place. And there's some traditions that say that Nimrod built the city of Ur, and he also built the Tower of Babel, right? And so if those things are connected, that's really interesting. We also have these traditions that Abraham actually was born in Sanli Urfa. And here's a picture of a cave where they believe he was born, just a few miles away from Göbekli Tepe. So really interesting. We've already talked about this. Here's one that I found fascinating, and it's hard for me to understand quite what it is, but it appears to be from, excuse me. It appears to be from a historian, a Mexican historian, who he claimed to find like the myth of the Tower of Babel, or the story of the Tower of Babel, written in some glyphs in Mexico somewhere. I don't remember where it was, but he says, and I'll read it out loud. He says, quote, "They would include this event of the confusion of tongues, or the Tower of Babel, on their charts, painting a round hill on the front of which a medal is seen placed, and a face engraved on it like that of an old man with a long beard. And outside the medal, there were many tongues that surround it and form a border." Now, this historian lived in the 1700s, and it's not entirely clear to me what he's describing here, but what's interesting is that when they painted the Tower of Babel, they drew a hill, a round hill, and they drew a medal on it, whatever that means. But you can see up in the top left here, there's like a picture of what Göbekli Tepe would have looked like. It is situated on a hill, and this is actually the background here is an old picture of what Göbekli Tepe looked like before they started to excavate it. It was a giant hill, and it's on a hill. And so, as far as like people who they'll argue with me, or they'll say, well, Göbekli Tepe can't be the Great Tower because it's not a tower. It's interesting that these native Mexicans, these ancient ones, they knew that, or they thought that the tower, this great confusion of tongues, started from a hill, which is really interesting. Yeah, and here's just some things that I didn't make slides for, and that's kind of the end of the Göbekli Tepe stuff. Do you guys have any questions about that? I could go on about other things, or we can call it a night, whatever is best for you guys.
Well, I would say it's really interesting, everything. But yeah, I don't know if you, Juan, have any questions.
Yeah, any questions or anything
No,
I forgot?
de mi parte no hay ninguna pregunta al respecto. Me ha parecido bastante interesante. Lo que sí podríamos es cómo conciliaríamos el introducir algunos elementos de Mesoamérica en esta defensa que haces de vincular Göbekli Tepe con los Jareditas, y cómo conciliaríamos también el hecho de que se meten algunos relatos que son tardíos, como Abraham o los egipcios, con algo que es mucho anterior y que ya está transcurriendo acá en América.
Give me a sec. Okay, so he's asking how would you conciliate the elements that you mentioned to defend about the tower. For example, this thing that you mentioned about Mesoamerica with the Jaredites would happen like many, many years before. And also the stories that you mentioned that they are like many years after, for example, Abraham and everything they and things that happen in America that they are like way after the Jaredites. How would you conciliate those elements?
Yeah, okay. So the people will go through the book of Ether, and they'll go through the genealogy or the list of kings, the king list, right? And there's not really a ton of information as far as like how old these people were and like how long they reigned for. There is some, but not a lot. And they'll just say, okay, well, if we assume a generation is 35 years or whatever they do, and they multiply it by 24 or however many people there are, and they come to this number, and it seems to fit, right? Seems to fit like, oh, well, if the Jaredites got there about 2000 BC and then they died, they were destroyed about 600 BC, then this fits if we do that math. And obviously it's an estimation. It's not entirely accurate. But if you actually read if you read the list, and you can kind of see that there's some more details there than most people will talk about. And I don't know if I can share my screen. Let's try that real quick. Oh boy. Okay. Let's see. Yeah. So.
Muchas gracias.
Okay. Can you guys see that?
Yep.
Okay. So this is from my website, and this is the Jaredite king table, and it shows how actually it talks about the lineage of kings in two different chapters or two different places. The first place is in Ether chapter 1, and the second place would be the rest of the book of Ether. And in some places they call like Oriha as the son of Jared, right? And in some places it's not quite consistent. So for example, Shez here. Shez, it's in chapter 1, it says he's the son of Heth. But if you actually go into the book, he says he's a descendant of Heth. And so the question is, well, which one do we believe? Is he a son, or is he like a grandson, a descendant? Because it's kind of weird to call your own son, your descendant. Like, it's not that it's not true. Like, your son is your descendant, but just call him your son, right? Also, you get to Morianton here, and he is called a descendant in both places. And so we probably could assume that there are multiple missing generations right there. Get down to Aaron. He's called a descendant in chapter 1, but it's kind of unclear what is supposed to be in the rest of the book. Like, is he a son or is he just a descendant? It just says begat. And that has, that can mean multiple things. Again, here's some other instances where it says descendant. And so I think I can justify that by showing that we really don't know how long these people were in the Americas. Like, we don't know when they got there. It never says the date, and it never says the starting date. It never says the ending date. And so how can we possibly know? We can make estimations, but the truth is that we don't have enough information to make accurate estimations, right? And if there are so many generations that have been skipped, we have no idea how many have been skipped. And there's at least 3 or 4 places where it says the guy is a descendant of the preceding guy, and so we just can't know. Hopefully that answers your question.
Pues ha sido una interesante conversación con Ryan Hinkley de el blog Science is True and the Truth is Too, y le agradecemos mucho esta presentación para el mundo de habla hispana, porque es un tema interesante, es único dentro de la blogósfera sud, y en particular no solamente tiene este tema en su blog, desarrolla otros temas relacionados con la ciencia, con los dinosaurios, con la evolución, y otros datos muy interesantes. Les recomiendo especialmente que vean la relación que tienen los ciclos de Venus con la historia de los Jareditas, que él también presenta, y para mí me parece un blog bastante ilustrativo y bastante diferente, por lo cual decidimos invitarlo a la Hoja del Olivo, y les invitamos a ustedes a que lo puedan conocer. Muchas gracias, Ryan.
Thank you so much. It's been a privilege to talk to you guys. Thanks.
Thank you again. And yeah, there's just one more comment. Luis Valdez saying like, I just want to say thank you very much, Juan, Javier, and Ryan, for your time and your exposition.
Yeah.
Y bueno, pues ahí tienen una propuesta diferente que pueden analizar con más detalle en su blog, y les dejaremos el enlace y la descripción del mismo para que puedan visitarlos. Muchas gracias y muy buenas noches.
Good night. Thank you so much. Yep. See you.